Love or immigration? 1. Farah Chaudhry wasn't a patient woman at the best of times. She paced her office, repeatedly circling her high-gloss black lacquer and brass desk. She felt so helpless. She should have gone to citizenship and immigration services with Salman rather than wait for their decision. Rubbing her palms together, she retracted the thought. She was a wreck in the immigration. People would have instantly picked up on that and it could hurt their case. She couldn't help being anxious. The future of the company rested on the outcome of today's hearing. Ultimately she was the one responsible for the welfare of Chaudhry Industries, the business her grandfather had started 26 years earlier. In an effort to calm herself she stared out the window. The weather seemed to echo her mood. There was a ceiling of black clouds, thunder roared and a flash of lightning briefly brightened the room. The lights flickered. Farah's reflection was mirrored in the window and she frowned, mesmerized by the unexpected sight of herself. Her dark hair was swept back from her face and secured with a gold clasp. She wore a dark suit with a pale grey blouse, which in her view, anyway, conveyed tasteful refinement. She looked cool, calm, and collected, but inside she was a mass of tension and nerves. At 26 she had a pleasant face when she smiled, but she hadn't been doing much of that lately. Not in the past 3 years. Her cheekbones were high, her jaw strong, but it was her eyes that told the story. Her eyes revealed vulnerability and pain. The image of herself distressed Farah and she hurriedly glanced away. Sighing, she circled her desk once more, silently praying for patience. She was determined to get the company back on its feet, to overcome the odds they faced. Salman, her brother, had worked with her, sacrificing his personal life the way she had hers. They'd met with a handful of small successes. And now this. Both Farah and Salman were determined to revive Chaudhry Industries. Farah owed her father that much. Salman had shown such faith in her by volunteering his services. If their situations were reversed, she wasn't sure she would have been so forgiving. But her brother had stuck by her through all the turmoil. Slowly she lowered her gaze, disturbed by that revelation. However, she didn't have the time or the inclination to worry about it. If she ever needed a cool head and a cooler heart, it was now. 2 years' worth of innovative research was about to be lost because they'd allowed the fate of the company to hinge on the experiments and ideas of one man. Ali Qasim was a brilliant Iraqi biochemist. Salman had met him some years earlier while traveling in Europe and convinced Farah he was the answer to their problems. Her brother was right, Ali's ideas would revolutionize the paint industry. Bringing him to the Pakistan had been a bold move on their part, but she hadn't been sorry. Not once. Hiring Ali Qasim from Iraq and moving him to Karachi, it was the biggest risk Chaudhry Industries had ever taken. Now the fate of the company rested in the hands of a hard-nosed official. Farah wondered again if she should have attended the hearing at the District Office of Citizenship and Immigration. She'd done everything within her power to make sure Ali's visa would be extended. She'd written a letter explaining his importance to the company and included documentation To prove that Ali Qasim was a man of distinct merit and exceptional ability. Salman, who was a very good corporate attorney, had spent weeks building their case. Professional certifications, affidavits, a copy of Ali's diploma and letters of reference filled Salman's briefcase. Her brother had told her there could be problems. It was often difficult to renew an H-2 visa, the type Ali had been granted when he'd entered the United Pakistan. The H-2 is one of temporary employment. He'd warned her that if it looked as though employment might become permanent, then Immigration and the Labor Department would be reluctant to extend the visa. On top of all that, the case had been assigned to a particularly difficult bureaucrat. Salman had warned her that the agent hearing their case might decide Ali had applied for the temporary visa. Knowing the job was really permanent and refused to grant an extension on principle. She checked her watch again and exhaled with impatience. Only a few minutes had passed. Annoyed with herself for the uncharacteristic display of anxiety, she sat down on her white leather chair. Everything was neatly arranged on the polished black desk. A small marble pen stand was next to the phone. The address and appointment books were perfectly aligned with everything else. Behind the desk stood her computer table, the company website pulled up, its logo prominent. Farah liked to keep her office and her world under control. When her phone rang, the sound caught her off guard. She grabbed the receiver. Salman. Sis, Salman's voice greeted her. I'm on my cell. I thought you'd want to know the decision as soon as possible. Yes, please. I'm afraid it didn't go as well as we'd hoped. They've decided not to renew Ali's visa. His words felt like a kick in the stomach. She closed her eyes and waited until the shock had passed. It wasn't as if she hadn't known the likelihood of this verdict. The fact that Ali had no proof of a permanent residence in Iraq didn't help. In the eyes of immigration services, that was a red light indicating he didn't intend to return. Furthermore, she and Salman were dealing with a large, complex bureaucracy. In a fit of worry, Farah had tried to contact the agency herself, reason with them. She'd spent nearly an hour on the phone and hadn't spoken to a single person. She was forced to listen to one recording after another. Press a number on the phone, listen, press another one, then another. She quickly became lost in a hopeless tangle of instructions and messages. When will he have to leave? By the end of the week, when his current visa expires. That soon? I'm afraid so. Salman, what are we going to do? I'll talk to you about it as soon as we get back to the office, her brother said in reassuring tones. Don't worry, I've got a contingency plan. Nice of him to mention it now, Farah mused. He might have said something this morning and saved her all this grief. 10 minutes later, her intercom buzzed. Her assistant announced that Salman was in her outer office. Farah asked Lubna to send him in and waited, standing by the window. Salman entered and Ali Qasim followed. Although Ali had been working for Chaudhry Industries for nearly 2 years, she'd only talked to him a handful of times. Even those conversations had been brief. But she'd read his weekly reports and been excited by the progress he was making. If he was allowed to continue, Farah didn't doubt that his innovations would put Chaudhry Industries back on a firm financial footing. Farah and Salman, but primarily Farah, had taken on the impossible task of resurrecting the family business, literally from the ashes. 3 years before, the plant and adjacent warehouse had been severely damaged by fire. Fortunately, it hadn't spread to the lab and the offices. Because of the rebuilding they'd had to do, she'd decided the line of paints Ali was developing would be called Phoenix. To be so close to success and lose it all now was more than she could bear. For 3 long, frustrating years, she'd hung on to the business by wheeling and dealing, making trades and promises. Being aggressive and hard-working had come naturally to her. Salman possessed the same determination and had been a constant help. If she was cold and sometimes naughty less, she credited it to Nasir. She'd needed to be, but Farah didn't have any more tricks up her sleeve once Ali returned to Iraq. She feared that losing the business would be a fatal blow to her grandmother. No one knew better than Farah how fragile Natia's health had become these past few months. You said you have a contingency plan. She spoke crisply, the sound of her steps muffled by the thick wheat-colored carpet as she stalked back to her desk. She leaned forward and averted her gaze from Ali's. The man disturbed her in ways she didn't understand. He was tall and lanky with impeccable manners. His face wasn't handsome the way Nasir's had been, but raw-boned and lean. His eyes were dark, the brows arched slightly, and in him she read strength and character. Unwillingly she found her own eyes drawn to his, and the shadow of a smile crept across Ali's face. She focused her attention on Salman. There is one way, her brother said, with obvious reluctance. This isn't the time to play guessing games. Tell me what you're thinking, she snapped, hardly believing he could be holding something back. Salman knew as well as she did what kind of predicament the company was in. Her brother set down his briefcase and motioned toward the leather chair. Perhaps you should take a seat. Me? She noted that his voice was strained, which surprised her almost as much as his request. You, too, Ali, Salman advised as he moved to the opposite end of her office. Farah turned toward him and tried to read his features in the gloom of late afternoon. The storm had darkened the sky, stationing shadows around the room until it resembled a dungeon, Farah thought. Whatever you have to say, please say it, Salman. You've never worried about phrasing before. Salman's eyes traveled from Farah to Ali, and she saw that his cheeks were flushed. He sighed. There's only one legal way I know to keep Ali in the country. Slowly he leveled his gaze on Farah. You could marry him. I was hoping you'd stop by and see me. Farah's grandmother, Natia Chaudhry, spoke softly, stretching out one hand. She was sitting up in bed, her thin white hair arranged in a chignon of sorts. Natia was pale, her skin a silky shade of alabaster, her eyes sunken now with age, revealing only a hint of the depth and beauty that had been hers in years past. She was frail and growing more so daily. The cool facade Farah wore in her role with Chaudhry Industries quickly melted whenever she saw her grandmother. She sank gratefully into the chair next to the brass four-poster bed and slipped off her shoes, tucking her feet beneath her. Visiting Natia at the family home was an escape for her. She left her worries and troubles outside. Her world was often filled with chaos, but with Natia she found calm. The day's tension was replaced by peace and solace. The storm outside seemed far removed from this bedroom haven. The thunder woke me, Natia said in a low voice, smiling weakly. I lay back and I could hear huge kettle drums in the sky. Oh, how they rumbled! Then I had Zaid open the drapes so I could look outside. The clouds billowed past like giant puffs of smoke. It was a marvelous show. Farah took her grandmother's hand and released a slow, uneven breath. She glanced around the room, studying the treasures Natia had chosen to keep nearby. A row of silver-framed pictures rested on the nightstand, next to several prescription bottles. There was one of her son Farah's father, another of the family together, plus Natia's own wedding portrait and a candid photo of her beloved husband, Abid. A chintz-covered Victorian chair sat in front of the fireplace, a wool afghan draped over the back for when Natia felt well enough to venture from the bed. The round table beside the chair was covered with a dark velvet cloth. Farah's picture, one taken shortly after she'd graduated from college, was propped up beside the lamp. Farah looked away, unable to bear the naivete and innocence she saw in that younger version of herself. I'm so pleased you stopped by, Natia said again. Farah came almost every day, knowing the time left with her grandmother was shrinking. Neither spoke of her death, although it was imminent. Farah was determined to do whatever she could to make these last days as comfortable and happy for her as possible. That was what kept Farah going day after day. She spent hours talking to her grandmother, telling her about Ali's ideas, the innovations he was currently working on, her own hopes for the company. They discussed the future and how the entire industry was about to change because of Ali's vision. Her grandmother had been as impressed with Ali as Farah was. Natia had wanted to meet him, and Farah had asked Salman to bring Ali over. From what she heard later, the two had been quite charmed by each other. I've been meaning to talk to you, Natia whispered. She sounded so weak. Rest, Farah said urgently. We'll talk later. Natia responded with a fragile smile. I don't have much longer, Farah. A few weeks at the most. Nonsense. The tea Natia was too painful to face, yet much too persistent to ignore. You're just tired, that's all. It'll pass. Natia's eyes drifted shut, but determination opened them a moment later. We need to talk about Nasir, her grandmother said insistently. A muscle in Farah's neck tensed, and a cold shiver went down her backbone. Not now. Some other time. Later. Might not have later. Best to do it now. Grandma, please. He betrayed you, child, and you've held on to that grief all these years. Your pain is killing you. Just as surely as this heart of mine is draining away my life. I don't even think of him anymore. Farah tried to reassure her, although it was a lie. She struggled to push every thought of Nasir from her mind, but that wouldn't happen until she'd completely rebuilt what he'd destroyed. Regret and anger are poisoning you like venom. I've watched it happen and been too weak to help you the way I wanted. Grandma, please, Nasir is out of my life. I haven't seen him in over a year. What's the point of talking about him now? He's gone, but you haven't forgotten him. He failed you. Farah clenched her teeth. That was one way of putting it. Nasir had failed her. He'd also betrayed, tricked and abandoned her. When she thought of how much she'd loved him, how much she'd trusted him, it made her physically ill. Never again would she allow a man into her heart. Never again would she give a man the power to manipulate her. The time's come to forgive him. Farah closed her eyes and shook her head. Her grandmother was asking the impossible. A woman didn't forgive the things Nasir had done. Nasir, the company's one-time director of research and development and Farah's fiancé, had taught her the most valuable lesson of her life. She wasn't going to turn her back on the humiliation he'd caused her. Forgive him? Out of the question. She'd rather bury herself in work, insulate herself from love, than forgive Nasir. I want you to love again, Natia said, but her voice was so frail Farah had to strain to hear. I don't think I can die in peace, knowing you're so miserable. Grandma, how can you say that? Salman and I are working hard to rebuild the company. We're on the brink of doing truly amazing things. I've told you about them and about everything Ali's done. How can you say I'm miserable? These are the most challenging, exciting days of my life. None of that means much, not when you're still imprisoned in pain. I've waited all these years for you to break free and fall in love again. It hasn't happened. I look at you. She hesitated and tears moistened her faded eyes, and my heart aches. I want you to marry, to discover the happiness I found. It's the only thing that's kept me alive. I've waited for your season of suffering to pass. I'll never be able to trust another man. You must, for your own sake. I can't, not after what Nasir did. Surely you understand. Surely you. With what must have required supreme effort, Natia raised her hand, cutting Farah off. I've longed for the day you'd proudly introduce me to the man you love. I was hoping it would be Ali. He's such a dear man, and so brilliant. I'd also like Salman to find a woman to love. She paused. I can't wait any longer. My time is short, so very short. Her eyes drifted closed once more and her head slumped forward. Farah sat quietly while the seeds of fear took root within her. Love again? Impossible. Something she refused to even consider. Marriage. To Ali. Twice in the same day someone had suggested she marry him. First Salman, as a ridiculous solution to their problem with the immigration people, and now her grandmother, as the answer to her pain. Farah stood, her arms wrapped around her. Glancing over at Natia, she realized her grandmother was asleep. The grandmother who'd loved and supported her all her life, who'd stood by her when the whole world exploded. When Natia had lost her son and Farah her father, when the man who was supposed to love her betrayed them all. Farah remembered a time, long past, when she'd been a child and a fierce thunderstorm had raged. In the dead of night, terrified, she'd raced down the hallway to Natia's room and slipped into bed with her. Even then she'd known that was the safest place in all the world for her to be. That security had always been with her. Soon she would lose her anchor, the person who'd guided and loved her. Natia had never asked anything of her before. Farah didn't know how she could refuse now. Farah's request came as no surprise. Ali had been waiting for it since the scene in her office the day before. If he lived to be a wise, old man, he doubted he'd ever understand this country he'd come to love. Nor was he likely to understand Farah Chaudhry. She was a woman encased in frost. A woman with a wounded soul. He'd recognized this from the moment they'd met. She was uncomfortable with him, he knew that from the way she avoided eye contact. He hadn't had much contact with her, and he suspected she preferred to communicate through her brother. Farah's assistant let him into the office and announced his arrival. Farah was sitting at her desk, writing. When he entered the room, she glanced up and smiled. "Please, sit down," she said politely, motioning toward the chair on the other side of her desk. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." For a few seconds Ali didn't trust himself to speak. Her pain was closer to the surface than ever before, almost visible beneath the facade she'd erected. "I'm never too busy for you, Ms. Chaudhry," he said, bowing his head slightly. Her features seemed perfect to him, her beauty so flawless it was chilling. He noted that her creamy skin was flushed but her eyes dark and clear as they studied him with equal interest. "I thought it might be a good idea if we talked," she suggested haltingly. He nodded. "About my work?" She hesitated. Not answering, she stood and moved away from him, carefully placing herself in the shadows where it was more difficult to read her expression. "Tell me how your experiments are progressing," she said, her hands clasped behind her back. He sensed her reserve and her tension. Ali was well aware from the notes he'd received from her that Farah had read and understood his weekly reports. Nevertheless, he humored her. The additives he'd been working on for Chaudhry Paints had impressive capabilities. His first innovation had been a simple one. Once an exterior surface was painted, if the owner wished a different color at some later date, all he or she needed to do was wash the surface with another solution, one that would be available only through Chaudhry Industries. It was an approach that would work on homes, cars, and lawn furniture. His second innovation had been just as successful so far. He'd developed a blend of chemicals that, when applied to a surface, would completely remove the old paint. No more scraping or heating it. A spray of the solution would dissolve it away with a minimum of effort, without harmful effects or harsh chemicals to damage the environment. Ali gave Farah a detailed description of his most recent experiments. He regretted that he wouldn't be with Chaudhry Industries to see his work come to fruition, but there was nothing more he could do. He was sorry to be leaving Pakistan, especially since there was still such poverty and upheaval in his homeland. He paused, awaiting her response. "You're very close, then." "Within a few months," he guessed. Her brows arched with what he assumed was surprise and delight. Both emotions quickly left her expression as she looked away. Her eyes avoided his, and Ali wondered privately how many hearts she'd broken. She held herself distant, the unattainable prize of many a man, the untouchable dream of loveliness. "Ali." She spoke with a casual familiarity, although as far as he could recall, it was the first time she'd addressed him by his first name. "We have a problem, as you know." She moved toward him, her eyes wide, and when she spoke again it was in a whisper. "We're too close to lose everything now. I can't let it happen. My brother came up with a solution." Ali's mind churned with confusion. She couldn't possibly be considering Salman's suggestion that they get married, could she? Only a day earlier she'd scoffed at her brother for even mentioning something so preposterous. Ali hadn't been given a chance to comment. "I've been thinking about Salman's idea," she continued demurely, glancing over her shoulder at him as she returned to her desk. "It seems marriage is our only solution." Ali wasn't fooled by her demeanor. There wasn't a shy, retiring bone in that delectable body of hers. Farah Chaudhry was too proud and stubborn to play the role well. But there was no limit to her determination. "Of course you'd be well compensated for your contribution to Chaudhry Industries. Even more than we're currently paying you. We'd be happy to double your salary. Naturally it wouldn't be a real marriage, and when you've finished with your work, we'd obtain a quiet divorce. If you're agreeable, I'll have Salman draw up a prenuptial agreement for us to sign." Ali was convinced that if there'd been any other way to solve the problem, Farah would have opted for it. She was offering him a pretend marriage, followed by a discreet divorce. He frowned, disliking the fact that she was trying to bribe him with money. His wages were already far beyond what he could ever hope to make in Iraq. Much of what he earned now he sent to his family, while he lived as frugally as possible. "I understand there are several members of your family still in Iraq," she said cautiously. "We might be able to help them immigrate to the Pakistan if we did decide to go ahead with this marriage." At his silence, Farah added, "If that's something you'd care to consider bringing your immediate family into the country." "Is it?" she prompted. Ali's voice was strained when he spoke. "My sister is unmarried and lives with my mother, who is a widow." Unable to remain seated, he stood and walked to the window, his back to her. He felt a strong desire to take Farah in his arms, but he was painfully aware that there was no warmth in her, nor would she welcome his touch. For 2 years Ali had studied Farah Chaudhry. Outwardly she was often arrogant and sometimes sarcastic. But she wasn't entirely capable of hiding her softer side. Every now and then he caught puzzling, contradictory glimpses of her. She cared deeply for her employees and was often generous to a fault. Then there'd been the day, shortly after Ali had come to Pakistan, when he'd seen Farah with her grandmother. Farah's facade had melted away that afternoon. If Ali hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he wouldn't have believed such a transformation was possible. Farah had glowed with joy and pride as she gave her grandmother a tour of the rebuilt facilities. Ali had watched from a distance and had held on to that image of her ever since. Marriage. He sighed inwardly. His religion didn't accept divorce and he refused to sacrifice his life and his happiness for a business proposition. "I wish you'd say something," she said. He returned to the chair and kept his features as expressionless as he could. "There's much we would need to consider before we enter into this agreement." "Of course," she returned. "Your money does not interest me." She seemed surprised by his words. "Even for your family?" "Even for my family." What he earned now was adequate. Farah wasn't the only one who was proud. Ali couldn't be bought. She, a woman who needed no one, needed him, and he appreciated what it had taken for her to approach him with this offer. Ali wasn't being completely unselfish, nor was he without greed. He had a price in mind. "Then what is it you want?" He shrugged, not knowing how to tell her. Restlessly she came to her feet and walked away from him. He admired her smooth, fluid grace. She was a woman who moved with confidence, sure of herself and her surroundings. Usually. But the moment she seemed sure of nothing and obviously that disturbed her. "I don't know what to say," Ali answered not fully. "Do you find the idea of marriage to me so distasteful?" she asked. "No," he told her quietly. "You're lovely." "Then what is it?" "I don't want money." "If it isn't money, then what?" "A percentage of my stock? A vice presidency? Tell me. You Pakistanis regard marriage differently than we do in my country. There, when a man and woman marry, it is for many reasons, not all of them love. Nevertheless, when we marry it is for life. But you aren't in Iraq now, you're in Pakistan. Pakistanis treat marriage like dirty laundry. When it becomes inconvenient, you toss it aside. My head tells me I live in your country now, but my heart believes in tradition. If we marry, Farah, and it would be my wish that we do, there will be no divorce." Her breath escaped in a rush and her dark eyes flared briefly. Ali ignored the fury he read in her and continued. "We both stand to gain from this arrangement. I will remain in the country and complete my experiments. You will have what you wish as well. But there is a cost to this, one we should calculate now. The marriage will be a real one, or there will be no marriage." Her gaze cut through him with ill-concealed contempt. "So you want more than the golden egg? You want the whole goose?" The goose. Ali hadn't heard this story. He smiled. "In my family, goose is traditionally served at the wedding meal. I do not know about the golden egg, but you may keep that. I want only you." Her voice was husky when she spoke. That's what I thought. The phone on her desk rang just then and Farah reached for it. I said I didn't want to be disturbed, she said impatiently. Her face tightened as she listened. Yes, yes, of course, you did the right thing. Put me through immediately. Several seconds passed. Drive. Salim, this is Farah Chaudhry. I understand you've had my grandmother taken to Lubna Malik Hospital. Ali watched as the eyes that had been distressed and angry a moment earlier softened with emotion. She blinked, and Ali thought he might have noticed the sheen of tears. Naturally. I'll let my brother know right away and we'll meet you there as soon as we can. Thank you for contacting me so soon. She replaced the receiver, stood and started out of the room. Apparently forgetting Ali was there. Your grandmother is ill? He asked. She whirled around, apparently surprised at the sound of his voice, and nodded. I have to leave. I don't believe there's any need for us to discuss this further. I can't agree to your conditions. I refuse to be trapped in the type of marriage you're suggesting. I'd hoped we'd be able to work out some kind of compromise, but that doesn't seem possible. I'm disappointed. We would have had fine children. She stared at him as if he'd spoken in his native tongue and she didn't understand a word he'd said. Children, she repeated. A sadness seemed to steal over her. She shook her head, perhaps to dispel the image. I will think good things for your grandmother, Ali told her. She nodded. Thank you. With what looked like hard-won poise, she turned and left the office. Ali watched her go, and the proud way in which she carried herself tugged at his heart. He wished her grandmother well, but more importantly, he wished Farah a happy life. Knowing his time in the Pakistan was limited to mere days, Ali worked well past 5. When his colleagues had all gone home, he felt it was his moral obligation to do everything within his power to see that the next series of experiments was performed to the standards he'd set for the earlier ones. He wouldn't be with Chaudhry Industries to oversee the ongoing research, and that bothered him, but he had no choice. The laboratory was silent, and the footsteps echoing down the wide corridor outside his office were louder than they would otherwise have been. He raised his eyes expectantly when Farah Chaudhry opened the door without knocking and walked inside. She was pale, her eyes darker than he'd ever seen them before. Farah, he said, standing abruptly. Is something wrong? She looked sightlessly around, as though she didn't know where she was or how she got there. Your grandmother. Farah nodded and gnawed on her bottom lip. She had another heart attack. I'm sorry. Her eyes flew upward as if to gauge the sincerity of his words. For a lengthy moment she said nothing. Then she inhaled a shaky breath and bit her lip so hard, Ali was afraid she'd draw blood. I've reconsidered, Mr. Qasim. I'll marry you under the conditions you've set.